There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from Chicago is Omar Baddar. He's a political analyst, human rights advocate, and the deputy director of the Arab American Institute. Eugene Kontorovich, he's a law professor at George Mason University and the head of international law at the Department of the Kohelet Policy Forum in Jerusalem. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Debra Shushan. She is the Director for Policy and Government Relations at Americans for Peace Now. And joining us from Tel Aviv is Simcha Rothman. He is a legal advisor for Meshilut, the Israel Movement for Government and Democracy. Simcha, I'd like to start with you. Highly unusual move. That's what people are saying right now. Israel, unique. It is a democracy in an area of the world not known for that. What signal does it send when you say you're going to bar two members of Congress from your strongest ally?
I think the message is that Israel is a nation that keeps its laws. The law in Israel is quite clear. It says anyone who supports BDS is to be banned from Israel. It's just simple as that. Israel maybe at the beginning thought that because they are congresswomen and they will get some kind of special treatment. When we discovered that what they're going to use the trip in Israel to further the BDS movement and to make it even stronger, there is no point in letting them get in. And I think that the outcome that we saw at the end, that they got a humanitarian visa to get and visit the grandmother, and they just said, oh, okay, so if we can't use it against Israel, then we're not coming. So I think it's quite clear.
Omar, I want you to pick up on that. Firstly, your reaction to that. Indeed, do you think that's the message? And does it really bring more attention to the BDS, which we'll get into in just a minute? Let's listen to what Prime Minister Netanyahu had to say when he was discussing the rules behind the initial ban.
As a vibrant and open democracy, we accept all the visitors and all the criticism, and we have done this in receiving all the Republicans and the Democrats along the years, including in the past week with open arms. But there's one thing we are not willing to do in accordance with the law. We are not willing to accept into Israel people who are calling for the boycott of Israel. Indeed, people who are working towards the delegitimization of the Jewish state.
Omar, I want to pick up on that because you have had some pretty harsh language in the past. You said previously that this should, quote, put to rest the delusion that Israel is a democracy that respects freedom of thought. Does Israel not have the right to admit or not admit anyone into the country?
So I think you're laying the context correctly. I just want to dispute the initial description of Israel as a democracy. Israel is a democracy for a certain class of people, namely Jewish citizens of the state of Israel. Primarily, you have Arab citizens of Israel of Palestinian origin who have second-class citizenship with limited rights. And then you have millions of Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip who have no rights whatsoever, and Israel controls their lives. And they pretty much made that point by barring Rashida Talib and Ilhan Omar's entry. By the way, they were primarily going to meet with the Palestinians in the Palestinian territories. And by barring them, Israel simply demonstrated the fact that the Palestinians are a captive population who have no say whatsoever in what happens in their lives by saying that they have the right to permit U.S. lawmakers either to enter or not enter, that this is a decision that is held by them. And that is precisely the problem. The Palestinians ought to be a free people. They are under an occupation that is illegal at this point because the Palestinians fulfilled all their obligations to bring an end to that occupation. And basically, you have a situation here where American lawmakers, by the way, the U.S. is funding Israel to the tune of $40 billion per decade. And Israel then disregards all American policy preferences, continues to build settlements on top of the Palestinian territories. And if any lawmakers are going to be critical of Israel on this front, they're going to bar them from entering. I mean, the entire thing is just a joke. So we have a serious problem that ought to be fixed, and it gets fixed by the U.S. putting serious pressure on Israel to end that occupation, and by telling them that it's not acceptable to bar the entry of American lawmakers because they disagree with their views.
Eugene, I saw you very focused in on that response. Let's first listen to what a longtime senior Palestinian official, Hanan Ashrari, had to say about Israel's initial action.
This is really unacceptable. It's a direct insult to the American people. It's a direct insult to the representatives of the American people, and it's a way in which Israel shows that it is a dictatorship that cannot tolerate any criticism, and that it will prevent anybody from interacting with the Palestinian people or seeing the reality of this cruel and illegal occupation on the ground.
Again, Eugene, picking up on what Omar said just a moment ago, she goes on to say, you know, as we heard, Israel is a dictatorship that cannot tolerate any criticism. Those are strong words, and you've previously argued that Israel should admit both Omar and Talib. Is Israel being oversensitive about this criticism?
Israel has every right to take this position. The notion that not admitting these congresswomen, it makes Israel not a democracy, is absurd. You started this segment by asking, is this decision unique? So we know that many democratic countries ban visits, ban visas to legislators of fellow democracies, of allied countries, when their laws dictate. The United States, under the Obama administration, barred a sitting Israeli member of Knesset. They barred the current Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, for many, many years under both the Bush and Obama administration when he was the governor of a province in India. The United Kingdom has banned legislators from Israel, from other countries. China does not give visas to anyone simply because they're a member of parliament of a democracy. So it is consistent with being a democracy, and everything Omar said would really mean that America is not a democracy because it has barred entry to democratically elected leaders. Of course, that's absurd. This is a double standard for Israel. And I want to say they were not excluded because of their views. They were denied visas because they are working to foster an economic warfare campaign against the state of Israel. Those are actions, not words.
I'd like to
Israel
respond to that real
admits
quick.
tens of thousands of
Please let me
critics
finish,
every
Omar.
year.
Okay, I think Omar would like to respond to
Yeah.
that. I saw you shaking your head no virtually the whole time that Eugene was speaking.
We should be clear about the fact that Israel is not just barring these members of Congress entry into Israel, they're barring their entry into the Palestinian territories. The Palestinian territories are not Israel. Israel is legally obligated to withdraw from the Palestinian territories. And you have a situation that is effectively apartheid on the ground where Palestinians have no say in their own lives and determining their own future. If Israel is tired of dealing with this rhetoric, all they have to do is simply end the occupation of the Palestinian territories, start treating Palestinians as equal human beings, and there would not be a BDS movement anymore. There would not be this campaign of putting economic pressure on Israel to get them to abide by international law and respect human rights.
That's completely not true.
Okay, I want to get back to that in just a moment, but I want to bring Debra in to this discussion. She and I were talking. We had the luxury of being here on set while you gentlemen are all a remote area. And we were talking about Donald Trump's involvement in this. And U.S. President Donald Trump has not told the U.S. media whether he reached out to Israel ahead of a tweet. But Debra, I want to read this tweet to you. I know that you know it by heart. But Trump said, "It would show great weakness if Israel allowed Representative Omar and Representative Talib to visit." And using Trump's language, they hate Israel, all Jewish people, and there is nothing that can be said or done to change their minds. Minnesota and Michigan will have a hard time putting them back in office. They are a disgrace. Firstly, do you think it's proper for a U.S. president to weigh in, especially such harsh language in the internal affairs of another nation, especially considering what a strong ally Israel is, especially the Trump administration? And secondly, do you believe that the president's decision influenced Israel?
So thank you for those questions. First of all, I would go so far as to say that Trump's actions directly calling on the Israeli government, and it was, by the way, reported in the Israeli media, that Trump was putting pressure on the Israeli government not to allow Omar and Talib in before they were actually denied entry. It wasn't just the tweet. I would go so far as to say that that was disloyal as far as U.S. interests are concerned. I mean, the fact of having an American president encourage a foreign country not to allow two elected representatives of the United States in is unprecedented as far as I'm aware, and is absolutely shocking. As far as whether it had an impact, absolutely yes, it clearly had an impact. Ron Dermer, the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., had previously announced that Omar and Talib would be allowed in. Israel's entry law of 2017 does have provisions for exemptions to be issued. He said that they would be allowed in to show respect to elected officials of the United States. Obviously, once Bibi weighed in, once Prime Minister Netanyahu weighed in, Trump weighed in, because Bibi is so dependent on Trump, for electoral advantage in the upcoming elections, there was no way that he could say no.
Interesting. Simcha,
It's funny to see Debra and
I'm sorry, Eugene, go ahead. Finish.
Debra and Omar disagree here because Omar said that Congress needs to punish, that the U.S. needs to punish Israel for going against the policy preferences of the United States, but Debra is saying that Israel acted on the policy preferences of the President of the United States. You can't have it both ways. Israel is either listening to the President of the United States or insulting the United States. And it can't be that listening to the President is the same as insulting the United States.
Simcha, I want to bring you in on this because the U.S. conservative group, AIPAC, which has a lot of juice in the United States, has long been a staunch supporter of Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Here is how they responded with a message. We disagree with Representatives Omar and Talib's support for the anti-Israel, anti-peace BDS movement, along with Representative Talib's calls for the one-state solution. We also believe every member of Congress should be able to visit and experience our democratic ally Israel firsthand. Now, this comes from a major organization that has supported the United States. Is this a highly unusual move, and are you concerned that barring Congressman will cost Israel some support of Jewish people in the United States and non-Jews as well?
I think that I think the problem, as Eugene said, I think the problem is within U.S. and I think Israel should not intervene in the problems of the U.S. According to the fact that people within the U.S. Show weakness when they see anti-Semitism. As I'm sad to say, we heard here in this show anti-Semitism in action. When you call Israel an apartheid state, when you say Israel is an illegal occupier, and when you use double standards on Israel, if the people of the U.S., if the representatives of the Democratic Party in the U.S. show weakness and do not take the moral high ground and say those two congresswomen are a disgrace to the Democratic Party, are a disgrace to the U.S. Congress. If they don't say it, maybe it's a good thing that Trump did it because you shouldn't tolerate this kind of anti-Semitism, double standard, terror sympathizing. You just shouldn't. And I think that AIPAC, and maybe they want to keep their good friends in the Democratic Party. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not into American politics in that way. But I think it's a disgrace to the Democratic Party that these people they gave them support, they gave them backup. They shouldn't get it.
Okay, I want to bring others in a second, but Debra, you're furiously writing notes down there, and you were shaking your head. Was that language anti-Semitic?
Of course not. And it's so offensive to hear that claim leveled without any base when we here in the United States are dealing with a significant rise in anti-Semitism that is leading to synagogues being shot up by white nationalists. To hear these false accusations of anti-Semitism. The fact is, Israel is called an occupier because it is occupying territories according to international law that it conquered in 1967. It is in no way anti-Semitic to say that. So let's begin with that.
From what country?
It doesn't, I mean, the fact that you occupy territories that you conquered during law, I know Israel likes to say that these are disputed territories because they were controlled by Jordan before I mean, international law just doesn't agree with that claim. There is a consensus.
We have a disagreement with Jordan.
Outside of Israel, there's a consensus that these territories are occupied. I'm sorry if you don't think so, and that's not your opinion.
Okay, let me stop there because I think you made some very good points, and we've been talking at length about BDS. Omar, let's talk about what BDS is, what it stands for, and the way this has played out. The two representatives who are not going to be going there to the West Bank now, has this just not brought more attention to the whole issue?
It sure has, but I just want to address two quick points that were mentioned earlier. The fact that Israel is an occupying force in the Palestinian territories is not just documented, is not just international law that is documented by the UN and the International Court of Justice, but also documented by every major human rights organization in the world. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and even Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem. So to believe that this is somehow anti-Semitic is effectively to believe that there is an entire anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that runs the entire world and every major human rights organization on the face of the planet. And this is just preposterous. It is absurd on its face. And as far as the contradiction that Eugene mentioned earlier, what he caught in the positions of mine and Debra's, let's be clear about the fact that long-standing U.S. policy has been opposed to the occupation and favoring a two-state solution. And in that sense, Israel has taken endless billions from the United States while disregarding the U.S. preference that Israel stop building illegal settlements on top of Palestinian lands. So absolutely, Israel was snubbing the U.S.
I think
in the case of Trump, there is a drastic
mentioning
reversal
of the money in the issue. I think that the fact that you're time and again mentioning the money may give the hint of a little bit anti-Semitism, because the money has nothing to do with it. The money that Israel gets as a support from the U.S. serves the U.S. interest. I think that all American lawmakers that supports it for many, many years might think that
if the occupation served American interests, the U.S. would not be opposed to it.
And if you will continue to mention it, maybe the claim for anti-Semitism will be a little bit stronger.
Okay,
so we're not allowed to talk about the fact that the U.S. gives Israel billions of dollars, and that the fact that the U.S. opposes
Gentlemen, I
the
think we've all made our point on
Those are
that.
things that we're not allowed to talk about?
Omar, I think we've made a point on that, but I want to get back to the core here, because this really centers around the BDS. Talk just a bit about that, and don't you think that just the way the heated rhetoric has built up around the world, it has focused more attention on that?
Absolutely. I think it has focused attention, and rightly so. I mean, they've simply highlighted the fact that Israel was caught in a difficult situation, let's be honest. If they let these members of Congress in, they were going to document the apartheid that exists on the ground, the mistreatment of Palestinians, the severe human rights violations, and they were going to come back and report on it, which would have made the case for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that is attempting to put economic pressure on Israel to abide by international law. And by not allowing them in, they've simply exposed that there is something to hide, which brings attention to it as well. So Israel is caught between a rock and a hard place. And the only way to get around this issue is to end the occupation and start treating Palestinians as equal human beings. Then there would be nothing to hide, and there would be no attention that needs to be brought to the situation altogether.
Okay, Omar. Now, Eugene, you want to jump in there
the notion that Israel is hiding something is absolutely...
Okay.
The notion that Israel is trying to hide something is absolutely ridiculous. There are more foreign journalists here, I think, than per capita than anywhere else. The occupation is written about in the New York Times and on CNN and every day. The notion that Israel is trying to hide something is not correct. What Israel is trying to do is keep out people. And in the Israel, I have to say, the Holocaust and Nazi Germany are taken a little bit personally. And Representative Omar is someone who compared Israel to Nazi Germany and who said we need to struggle against Israel the way we struggled against Nazi Germany. That is something which in Israel is a pretty hard thing to take.
Okay, gentlemen, I want to get back on this.
One of the reasons Israel banned them.
Let's get back on the subject about the two representatives as well, because Talib appealed her ban at first on the humanitarian grounds in a letter to the Israeli government when she wanted to visit her 90-year-old grandmother in the West Bank. Now, Israel agreed, but with restrictions, including not to promote the boycotts against Israel during her trip. Now, after first agreeing, she changed her mind, and this is what she said in a tweet. When I won, it gave the Palestinian people hope that someone will finally speak the truth about inhumane conditions. I can't allow the state of Israel to take away that light by humiliating me and my love for my city, the Arabic word for grandmother, to bow down to their oppressive and racist policies. Picking up on what you were talking about, Eugene, strong words. There are a lot of correspondents from around the world there. How is this going to play out?
The point here is not the media appearance. They have engineered a situation where it's going to be bad press for Israel either way. But Israel needs to be seen as following its own laws, and that's what's happening here. We could not make an exception for these congresswomen. And I think it's also going to focus attention on the fact that they are promoting boycotts of Israel. They are trying to engage in a campaign of economic warfare against Israel, which does not have to do with the 1967 borders, which calls for a return to people who left here in 1948, or even their descendants, which calls for the end of Israel as we know it, the end of Israel as a Jewish state. That is their agenda, and they've become more open about this agenda. They've become quite clear about it, and I think people are going to see that the Democratic Party is being pulled hard in the way of Corbyn anti-Semitism.
Okay.
It is being Corbynized, and it's a slippery slope.
Deborah, I want you to jump in because I know you want to, but Israel's interior minister tweeted his response about Talib as well. And in it, he said, I approved her request as a gesture of goodwill on a humanitarian basis. But it was just a provocative request aimed at bashing the state of Israel. Apparently, her hate for Israel overcomes her love for her grandmother. Those are strong words.
Those are disgusting words, and we heard them echoed by the President of the United States when he even floated the ridiculous conspiracy theory that maybe Representative Talib doesn't actually have a grandmother, but if she did have a grandmother, then her grandmother's lucky because she wouldn't actually have to see Rashida Talib. I mean, these are just disgusting things that we're hearing, and an effort to I mean, the idea that Representative Talib's trip would go from being a trip that would be centered around congressional oversight, which is her job, to go to the Palestinian territories and see how U.S. policy is dramatically and negatively affecting Palestinians, and then turn it into a humanitarian cause, is really just a microcosm of the way that Israel and some here in the United States too have sought to turn Palestinians into a purely humanitarian issue and take away their political drive for national self-determination. Please don't interrupt me. And one other point I just want to make, if I could quickly, is that Mr. Kontorovich, as you've heard, represents what I like to call the anti-BDS movement. And that anti-BDS movement is not actually about economic warfare against Israel. It's actually about protecting the occupation, protecting settlements, and we can see that in the fact that the entry law, Israel's 2017 entry law, isn't just directed against boycotts against Israel, but anyone who boycotts settlements and occupation. And the same is true of many of these anti-BDS laws that we've seen passed around the country by states, and also initiatives that we've also seen in Congress. The fact that Congress would pass an anti-BDS resolution, and you have 21 members of Knesset send a letter to Congress and say, well, thank you, but actually this is problematic because that resolution also promotes two states, and BDS and the two-state solution is a bigger threat to Israel than BDS, shows that the real desire here is to protect the occupation and settlements and forward annexation.
Now, gentlemen, hang on. I have time for one more question, and I want to bring Simcha in one last time, because I want to talk about Netanyahu and now how this is going to play out for him. Because for the first time in the nation's history, Parliament voted to dissolve itself and call a second election. Prime Minister Netanyahu failed to form a ruling coalition earlier. So how do you see the controversy playing out over the two representatives in that re-election effort?
I don't think it will affect the chances of Netanyahu winning the next election or losing the next election, because I think that there may be 21 Knesset members that, for some strange reason, want to get American lawmakers involved in Israeli inner politics, as many other around the world would want. But I think the majority of the public in Israel thinks that Israel needs to protect its citizens, needs to protect its borders. And I have to remind you, there are apartheid roads in Judea and Samaria where Jews cannot go through. There are people sitting in hospital, a brother and a sister. There are brother and a sister sitting in hospital as we speak because someone run them down just because they are Jewish. There are no elections in the Palestinian Authority for many, many years because Abu Mazen, also known as Mahmoud Abbas, the Holocaust deniers, he knows that if there will be an election, the people in the Palestinian people will choose Hamas, an organization that wants to kill all Jews regardless of 1967 borders, wants to kill all Jews because they are Jews. That is what we are facing here in Israel. So the question, if two lawmakers that are terror sympathizers and they compare Israel to Nazi Germany, if they will come in here or not, will not affect Netanyahu's chances.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm sorry we are running out of time. We have to go. We knew this one had the potential to live up to its name as The Heat, and it certainly did that today. And that does it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Sean Calebs in Washington, D.C. As always, thanks for joining us.